The morning of her wedding, Miss Eleanor Ashworth rose before dawn and dressed herself in the grey silk gown that had been her mother's, altered twice and pressed with careful hands the night before. There was no maid to help her, no mother to fasten the buttons down her back, no sister to tie the ribbon of her bonnet with trembling fingers and laughing tears. There was only the narrow room at the top of her aunt's house, the single window that looked out over the mist-shrouded garden, and the cold weight of a decision she had made 3 days ago and could not now unmake. The candle on her dressing table guttered in the draught from the ill-fitting window frame, and Eleanor leaned close to the spotted glass to pin up her hair. The face that looked back at her was not the face of a bride. It was the face of a woman who had learned, over 28 years, to expect nothing and to be grateful for less. The gray eyes were steady, the mouth was firm, and the lines at the corners of her eyes were the furrows of sleepless nights and unspoken words. She had not slept at all the night before, and the hollows beneath her cheekbones bore witness to it. "You will do," she told her reflection, and the reflection stared back with the flat calm of a woman who had long ago stopped arguing with herself. "You will do very well." She had no jewelry of her own. Her mother's few pieces had been sold to pay the undertaker when her father died, and what remained had gone to her father's creditors, but she had pinned a small spray of dried lavender to the bodice of the gown, a last gift from her mother before the wasting sickness had taken her. The lavender still held a ghost of its scent, and Eleanor pressed her finger to it as she would have pressed her finger to a wound, feeling the small stab of memory that was both comfort and pain. Below, the house was stirring. She could hear the servants in the kitchen, the rattle of pans and the low murmur of voices. Her aunt, Lady Maud Trevelyan, would not rise until noon. She never did, and had declared that she would not attend the wedding in any case. "I cannot stomach the vulgarity of it," she had said the night before, settling herself against her pillows with a volume of sermons that she had been reading for the past 6 months and would likely never finish. "A stranger appearing at my door, asking for my niece's hand, and you accepting him without so much as a fortnight's acquaintance. It is indecent. It is almost French." Eleanor had said nothing. She had stood at her aunt's bedside, her hands folded before her, and let the words wash over her as they had for the past 5 years. Lady Maud was not cruel, precisely. She was simply a woman who had been disappointed by life so many times that she had grown a carapace of complaint and called it wisdom. She had taken Eleanor in when her brother died, and she had never let her forget it. Eleanor was not a niece, she was a charity case, a dependent, a companion who was expected to be grateful for the privilege of being invisible. "A man who will not tell you his business," Lady Maud continued, warming to her theme. "A man who will not tell you where he comes from, who his people are, how he means to support you. A man who arrives in a hired chaise with no luggage, no servants, and a face that has been—" She paused, her lips pursing. "Well, we shall not speak of the face. It is not his fault, poor creature. But it speaks of trouble, Eleanor. Trouble and violence and the sort of life that leaves marks on a man." "The war leaves marks on many men, Aunt," Eleanor had said quietly. "It does not make them wicked." "No," Lady Maud had agreed, but her voice had been doubtful. "No, I suppose not. But it does not make them good either. And you know nothing of him. Nothing. A name, a ship, a promise of an income that he cannot prove, and a ring he has not yet produced. It is the stuff of novels, Eleanor, and we all know how those end." Eleanor had not replied. She had only bent to kiss her aunt's dry cheek. The old woman had flinched, surprised by the gesture, and then softened despite herself, and had left the room with her candle and her silence. She had known in that moment that she would go through with it. Not because she believed in the stranger's promises, not because she trusted his story, but because the alternative, the long gray years of dependency, the slow erosion of her selfhood, the eventual fate of being an old maid with no home and no prospects and no one to care for her, was worse. Much worse. A woman alone, her father had told her once, on the long winter evenings when he had still been able to sit by the fire, is a woman prey to every kindness and every cruelty. She must learn to see the difference, Eleanor, and she must learn to choose her fate, even when the choices are poor ones. This was a poor choice. She knew it. But it was a choice, and that was more than she had had in 5 years. The church was half a mile from her aunt's house, and Eleanor walked it alone, as she had walked everything alone for the past 5 years. The mist lay thick over the meadow, rolling up from the river like a living thing, and the grass was cold and wet beneath her thin boots. She had not thought to bring a carriage, she could not have afforded one, and her aunt's groom had been instructed not to trouble himself with her. So she walked, her gray silk skirts brushing the damp grass, her bonnet tied firmly beneath her chin, and the single spray of lavender pinned to her bodice like a talisman. The church was a small Norman building, set back from the road behind a lich gate that leaned as though it might give up and fall at any moment. Its grey stone walls were blotched with lichen, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle, as if the centuries of prayer had finally worn it down. The churchyard was thick with graves, their headstones tilted and moss-covered, and a single crow sat on the low wall and watched Eleanor approach with the bright, uninterested eye of a creature that had seen too many weddings and funerals to be impressed by either. The vicar was waiting for her at the church door, a thin, nervous man named Mr. Wilton who had the habit of blinking rapidly when he was uncomfortable. He was uncomfortable now. Eleanor could see it in the way his hands fluttered at his sides, in the way his eyes darted past her to the road beyond. "Miss Ashworth," he said, his voice carrying the particular tremor of a man who would rather be anywhere else. "I had not expected, that is, I had." "Good morning, Mr. Wilton," Eleanor said. "Is my groom arrived?" Mr. Wilton blinked rapidly, and his face contorted in the expression of a man who had been given a choice between a lie and the truth and had elected to suffer through the truth. "He is not, Miss Ashworth. But I am sure he shall be here presently. The roads are very wet this morning and the mist." "Yes," Eleanor said calmly. "The mist." She walked past him into the church, and the cold damp of the interior closed over her like water. The church had not been used for a wedding in many years. Most local couples chose the larger parish church in the village, where there was room for the congregation and a proper organ, and it showed. The candles in the sconces had been lit only that morning. Their flames wavered and flickered, casting long shadows up the whitewashed walls. A single arrangement of roses stood on the altar, their petals already beginning to droop, and the green baize cloth that covered the altar had been patched in several places. Eleanor walked to the altar rail and stood before it, her hands clasped loosely before her. She did not pray because she had long ago stopped believing that prayer changed anything. She waited, and as she waited, she watched the light change through the narrow windows, the mist thinning and thickening in the same slow rhythm as her own breathing. The clock on the tower struck the hour, and then the quarter hour, and then the half hour. He was not coming. She had expected it, had almost counted on it, in some small corner of her heart that had not yet learned to stop hoping, and yet the certainty of his absence struck her like a physical blow. The stranger had come to her aunt's house 3 days ago, had spoken to her for a quarter of an hour in the morning room, had made his proposal with the curt brevity of a man who was used to getting what he wanted and who had not expected to have to argue for it, and then he had left, promising to return for the ceremony. He had not asked for her hand in the usual way, had not paid court, had not brought her flowers or compliments or protestations of affection. He had told her, in the flat voice of a man who had been through too much to be moved by anything, that he would marry her, that he would provide for her, that he would not trouble her with his presence if she preferred it, and that he expected nothing from her but her name and her cooperation. She had agreed. She had agreed because she had seen in his pale gray eyes the same dead weight of necessity that she carried in her own heart. He did not want her. He needed her. And that, at least, was a kind of honesty. But now he had not come, and she was left standing in a cold church, an old vicar shuffling his feet behind her, and the weight of her foolishness settling over her shoulders like a shawl made of lead. "Miss Ashworth," Mr. Wilton said, his voice tentative. "I am sure there is some explanation. A delayed carriage or a... There is no delay," Eleanor said. "He is not coming." She did not turn from the altar. She had turned from too many things in her life, and she had learned that it did not help. The emptiness was still there, behind her, before her, inside her. Turning only made it worse. "I see," Mr. Wilton said. And then, because he was a kind man, and because he had known her father many years before, and because he had seen too much of the world's cruelty not to recognize it when it was standing before him in a grey silk gown with a spray of lavender pinned to its bodice. "Shall I have the carriage brought round, Miss Ashworth? It is a cold morning, and I would not have you walk home." "No," she said. "I shall walk. I have walked to many things, Mr. Wilton, and I have found that the walk back is always easier than the walk there." She turned then, and she walked back up the aisle, and she did not look at the vicar, and she did not look at the drooping roses on the altar, and she did not look at the door, where a tall figure in a dark coat was standing, outlined against the pale morning light, with the mist rolling in behind him like a tide coming home. He was not a stranger. She knew him. Richard Hawke stood in the doorway of the church with the mist at his back and the cold morning light falling across his face, and he looked at the woman he had come to marry with the expression of a man who had seen too much to be surprised by anything, and yet was surprised by her. She was standing in the aisle, midway between the altar and the door, and she was looking at him as though she had seen a ghost. Her face had gone the color of the mist outside. Her hands were pressed to her breast, and the spray of lavender on her bodice was trembling with the rapid beat of her heart. He had seen many women in his life, in the ports and cities of half the world, and he had learned to read them the way a sailor reads a sky, for warning, for pleasure, for the quick shift of weather that meant trouble. But this woman he could not read at all. Her face was a closed door, and behind it there was only shadow. "You are late," she said. Her voice was steady, though her hands were not. "I had thought you were not coming." "I had thought it myself," he said, and he stepped into the church, letting the door close behind him with a soft thud of wood against stone. The sound seemed to echo through the small space, as though the church itself had been holding its breath and had now released it. "My carriage broke an axle 3 miles out. I walked the rest of the way. The mist delayed me." "Ah," she said. "The mist." She said it in the same voice she had used with the vicar, a voice that contained a universe of meaning and gave away nothing. He recognized the voice because he had used it himself many times on people he did not trust and did not wish to know. The vicar had come forward, his hands clasped together in a gesture that was almost prayer. "Captain Hawke," he said, his voice relieved. "We were just beginning to, that is, I had thought, but here you are and all is well, all is very well, and we shall proceed, shall we not?" "Yes," Hawke said. "We shall proceed." He had not looked away from Eleanor. She had not looked away from him. They stood in the cold, draughty church with the flickering candles and the drooping roses and the nervous vicar fluttering between them, and he thought, "This is the woman I have chosen. This is the woman I have married." He did not know her. He had spoken to her once, for a quarter of an hour, in a morning room that smelled of beeswax and old books. She had listened to his proposal with her hands folded in her lap and her face composed, and she had said yes in the same flat voice she used for everything else. He had not asked her why. He had not wanted to know. But now, standing in this cold church with the mist pressing at the windows and her gray eyes fixed on him with that unreadable calm, he found that he did want to know. He wanted to know everything about her. He wanted to know why a woman of her age and breeding was still unmarried, why she was living with a great-aunt who did not seem to like her, why she had accepted a proposal from a stranger who had come to her door with nothing but his name and his scars. He wanted to know why she was looking at him as though she had seen a ghost. "You know me," he said. It was not a question. He had learned, in the Navy, to recognize the moment when recognition struck. "No," she said. "I do not." But her voice had cracked on the word, just slightly, and he had heard it. The vicar was clearing his throat, looking between them with an expression of profound discomfort. "Shall we begin?" he asked. "The hour is already late and I have another, that is, I am expected at." "Begin," Hawke said. He walked down the aisle toward her, his boots echoing on the worn stone floor. The years of naval discipline were in his stride. He walked the way he did everything, with a purpose and a stillness that did not quite conceal the violence underneath. He had been a good officer, they had said. A man who could keep his head in any weather. A man who could be relied upon to do what needed to be done, no matter how unpleasant it was. He had done unpleasant things. The scar on his face was only the most visible of them. Eleanor did not step back as he approached. She stood her ground, her hands clasped before her, her chin lifted, and he felt a reluctant stir of admiration for her courage. She was afraid of him. He could see it in the whiteness of her knuckles, in the rapid flutter of her pulse at her throat, but she was not going to run. "Miss Ashworth," he said, stopping a few feet from her. "I have brought the ring." He had not brought a ring. He had forgotten to buy one, and it had occurred to him only that morning as he was dressing in the cramped rooms of the coaching inn. He had gone to the village shop, a damp place that smelled of tallow and pig feed, and he had bought the only ring they had, a plain gold band old and scratched, that had been in a drawer of assorted oddments for the past 10 years. The shopkeeper had charged him 4 shillings and told him it had once belonged to a woman whose husband had gone to the wars and never come back. He had not told Eleanor that. He had not told her anything. He held out the ring now and she looked at it and something flickered across her face, surprise or recognition or something else entirely. He could not read it. She had closed the door again, and behind it there was only the same careful blankness. "It is not a new ring," she said. "No," he said. "It is not. Shall I take it as an omen?" "If you wish." He did not have the skill to make it a joke. He had never had that skill, and the war had taken what little he had possessed. "It is only a ring, Miss Ashworth. It will serve its purpose." "Yes," she said. "It will." She held out her hand and he put the ring on her finger. It was too large. It slid past her knuckle and hung loosely against her palm. He could feel the warmth of her skin through the cold metal, and the contact, brief as it was, seemed to him like a kind of betrayal. He was taking something from her that he had no right to take. The vicar began the service. His voice rose and fell in the accustomed rhythms, the words worn smooth by centuries of repetition. Hawke did not listen to them. He was looking at the woman before him, at the slight tremor in her hand, at the way her mouth had settled into a firm line, at the spray of dried lavender on her bodice. He knew that lavender. He had seen it once before on a hillside in Portugal, growing wild among the ruins of a convent that had been shelled by French artillery. He had walked through it with his company, and the scent had been so thick and sweet that it had made him dizzy, and he had thought, "This is what peace smells like. This is what it would be like to be a man who had never held a rifle." "You may kiss the bride," the vicar said, and Hawke started and looked at Eleanor, and saw that she was looking at him with something that might have been dread. He did not kiss her. He took her hand, the left one, the one on which the ring hung loose, and he pressed it once, quickly, as a man might press the hand of a comrade he would never see again. The glove was thin, and he could feel the bones of her fingers through the silk. "Thank you," he said, and he did not know what he was thanking her for. She did not answer. The vicar was signing the register with a flourish. Hawke signed his name in the firm, clear hand that his father had beaten into him as a boy. He watched Eleanor sign hers, and he read the name she wrote, Eleanor Charlotte Ashworth. Charlotte. She had not told him her middle name. He had not asked. When they walked out of the church together into the pale morning light, the mist had begun to lift, and the sun was a faint gold smear behind the clouds. The crow had flown, the churchyard was empty. The hired chaise was waiting at the gate, its driver dozing on the box, and Hawke could see, through the window, the small valise that was all Eleanor had brought with her. "You travel light," he said. "I have little to travel with." She did not look at him. She was walking toward the chaise with the same purposeful stride she had used on the aisle, her head high, her shoulders back. "Your driver did not think to bring your luggage?" "I have none." He opened the chaise door for her. "I travel as I am. It is simpler." "Yes," she said. "I imagine it is." She climbed into the chaise without his help, settling herself on the worn velvet seat with the careful precision of a woman who had learned to make herself small. He followed her, and the door closed, and the chaise lurched forward onto the road. They drove in silence for the first mile. The road wound through the misty meadows, past hedgerows hung with cobwebs and fields where the sheep stood like white stones in the grey morning. Eleanor sat with her hands folded in her lap, the too large ring glinting dully on her finger, and she stared out the window at the landscape passing. "I knew you," she said, and her voice was so quiet that he almost did not hear it. "I knew you once." He looked at her. The closed face was still closed, but something had shifted behind it. He could see the effort it cost her to speak. "When?" he asked. "Where?" "I was a child. 10 years old, perhaps 11. My father took me to the dockyards at Plymouth to see the ships." She paused, and her hand went to the lavender on her bodice, touching it as if to reassure herself that it was still there. "You were a midshipman, I think. Barely older than I was. You had auburn hair and freckles, and you gave me a piece of—" She broke off, and her voice faltered. "It does not matter. It was a long time ago. You would not remember." He did not remember. He had been a midshipman, yes, all those years ago, and he had been to Plymouth, and he had seen 1,000 children on the docks, 1,000 little girls with their fathers and their ribbons and their wondering eyes. But he did not remember her. "Eleanor," he said, "I am sorry." "Do not be sorry." Her voice had steadied. "It is not your fault that you do not remember. Why should you? I was no one. I am no one. I was only a child who had never seen the sea, and you were kind to me, and I have carried that kindness with me for 18 years. She turned to look at him then, and for the first time, he saw something other than the careful blankness in her eyes. There was a hurt in them, a deep and ancient hurt, and beneath the hurt, the ghost of a hope that she was trying very hard to extinguish. "I thought," she said, "when I saw you at my aunt's house, that it was coincidence." "A mistake. The years had changed you, of course, but I would have known you anywhere. I knew you the moment you walked into the room. And you did not say anything." "No." She turned back to the window. "I thought it would be easier if I did not. I thought that if I married you as a stranger, I could keep the memory of the boy you had been separate from the man you had become." She laughed, a soft, humorless sound. "I was a fool. Of course I was a fool. I have been a fool my whole life." "Eleanor." "Please do not call me that," she said. "It is too familiar. I am your wife, but I am not your friend. I am not your confidant. I am a convenience, and you are a convenience to me, and we will do better if we remember that." He had nothing to say to that. He had never been good with words, and the woman beside him was angry, and she had every right to be. He had used her as surely as he had used the ring he had bought from the village shopkeeper, and she had let him use her because she had nowhere else to go. It was the second most sordid thing he had ever done in his life. He looked out the window at the passing landscape, at the hedgerows and the fields and the pale gold smear of the sun behind the clouds, and he thought about the boy he had been 18 years ago, the boy with the auburn hair and the freckles, and he wondered if that boy would recognize the man he had become. Probably not. Probably that boy would have been ashamed of him. The chaise stopped at midday at a coaching inn called the White Hart, a sprawling building of red brick and white plaster that had been serving travelers for 3 centuries. The yard was busy with carriages and horses, the ostlers shouting and the grooms leading mounts to the water trough, and the air was thick with the smell of steaming oats and the particular busyness of a place where people passed through and did not stay. Hawke helped Eleanor down from the chaise, and she took his arm without complaint, though she did not look at him. He guided her through the courtyard to the inn door, past the coachman and their passengers, past a woman with a basket of chickens and a peddler with a pack on his back. The innkeeper was a round, bustling man named Mr. Pargeter, and he seemed to take a particular interest in the new arrivals. "Captain Hawke," he said, spreading his hands in a gesture that was half welcome, half calculation. "We have been expecting you. Your man arrived last night as you instructed. The rooms are prepared." "I do not have a man," Hawke said. "I have no servants." Mr. Pargeter blinked. "But the gentleman, tall fellow, dark hair, called himself your secretary. He was most insistent that I prepare the best rooms for you. He paid a full week's board in advance, and he said you would be arriving today with your bride." Hawke felt the cold settle in his stomach. "I have no secretary. I have no servants of any kind. I hired this chaise 3 days ago, and I have not spoken to anyone except my wife and the vicar since." The innkeeper's face had gone pale. "Then I have been imposed upon, Captain. The fellow showed me your direction, your name, your seal. He knew everything about you." "Show me the room," Hawke said. "Show me where he slept." The room was on the first floor at the back of the inn, overlooking the stable yard. It was a comfortable chamber, well appointed with a large bed and a writing desk and a fire that had been lit that morning. The candles were new, the linens were fresh, and on the writing desk there was a letter. Hawke picked it up. The envelope was addressed to him in a hand he did not recognize. He tore it open, and inside there was a single sheet of paper with a single line written on it. "Captain Hawke, welcome home. I have been waiting for you." "Who is he?" Eleanor asked. She was standing in the doorway, her face wary. "Who knows that you are here?" "I do not know." He folded the letter and put it in his pocket. "But he is someone who wants me to know that he is watching." "Is it a threat?" "It is a warning." He turned to look at her, and for the first time he saw fear in her eyes, not fear of him but fear of the unknown, of the shadows that had been following him since the war. "I should not have brought you into this." "No," she said. "You should not have." She said it without anger, without accusation. She said it the way she said everything, as a simple statement of fact. And for some reason that was worse than if she had shouted at him. "We will stay here tonight," he said. "It is not safe to travel on the roads after dark, not when there is someone who knows our movements. Tomorrow we will hire a post-chaise for the rest of the journey." "The rest of the journey to where?" "To my estate." He paused. "It is not an estate exactly. It is a house. A ruin mostly. On the coast." "Yorkshire?" "Yes." She said nothing to that. She only nodded, and she walked past him into the room, and she looked at the large bed with its fresh linens and its down pillows, and he saw her swallow. "I will take the floor," he said. "I am used to sleeping on hard surfaces. You will have the bed. You will not try to." "No." He said it more harshly than he had intended. "I will not try to. I did not marry you for that." "No," she said. "You married me because you needed a wife for reasons you will not explain, and I married you because I needed a roof over my head and food in my mouth, and we have made a contract and we shall honor it." She walked to the window and looked out over the stable yard. The late autumn sun was slanting through the clouds, catching the gold of the straw in the yard below and the red of the brick walls. A stable hand was leading a horse across the cobbles. The sound of the hooves echoed up, sharp and hollow. "I was not always a servant," she said, and her voice had changed, become softer, more contemplative. "I was not always a poor relation, my aunt's charity case, a woman who had to say yes to a stranger because she had no other choice. I was a child once, with a father who loved me, and a mother who sang, and a future that stretched out before me like a green meadow in the spring. And then my father died and my mother died, and the future closed up like a door, and I found myself on the other side of it, with nothing but my hands and my courage and my stubborn refusal to give up. She turned from the window to look at him. I will not be a victim, Captain Hawke. I have been a victim before and I did not like it. I will be your wife in name, and I will keep your house, and I will manage your affairs, and I will do it all with the same dignity that I have done everything else. But I will not be your victim. And if you ever try to hurt me, I will hurt you back. I have been hurt before and I know how to fight. He believed her. He looked at her standing in the window with the autumn light falling across her face and the too large ring on her finger glinting, and he believed every word she said. I will never hurt you, he said. I swear it on my life. Your life, she said, and her voice was strange. What is your life worth, Captain? What is any of it worth? He did not know how to answer that. He had been asking himself the same question for 6 years. Eleanor did not sleep that night. She lay in the large bed, the down pillows piled around her, and she stared at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of the unsettling around her. The walls creaked, the wind moaned in the chimney, and from the other side of the room she could hear the steady rhythm of Hawke's breathing. He had fallen asleep almost as soon as he had lain down on the floor, wrapped in a blanket he had taken from the wardrobe, and his sleep was the deep, untroubled sleep of a man who had learned to rest whenever he could. She envied him that. She had not slept soundly in years. Her hand went to the ring on her finger, the plain gold band that had belonged to another woman's husband. It was still loose. She had wrapped a piece of thread around the band to make it fit, but she could feel the slight roughness of the thread against her skin, a constant reminder that the ring had never been meant for her. She wondered what had happened to the woman who had worn it before. Had she been a bride like her, a woman who had married a stranger and found herself in a foreign country with no one to turn to? Or had she been happy, loved, cherished, until the war had taken her husband and left her with nothing but a ring that was too large and a grief that was too heavy? Eleanor did not know. She would never know. The ring had come from a drawer, a shopkeeper's oddment, and its history was as anonymous as her own. She sat up in bed and lit the candle on the bedside table. The flame flickered, casting long shadows up the walls. Across the room, Hawke stirred in his sleep but did not wake. She had seen the scar on his face for the first time in the full light of the chaise, and she had not been able to look away. It was not a recent scar. It was old, silver white, with the puckered edges of a wound that had healed badly. It ran from his temple down to his jaw, and it pulled his left eye slightly so that when he looked at her, it was with a kind of perpetual squint, as if he were always trying to see through a fog. He had not told her how he got it. He had not told her anything about himself. He was a stranger and he would always be a stranger, and she would have to live with that. She reached for her valise, a worn leather bag that had been her mother's, and she pulled it onto the bed beside her. Inside, wrapped in a handkerchief, was the one thing she had brought that she had not shown anyone, a bundle of letters tied with frayed ribbon, that her father had written to her mother in the early years of their marriage. She had read them 100 times. She had memorized every word. But she needed to read them again now in this strange room with the strange man sleeping on the floor, because the letters were the only thing in her life that had ever been true. The first letter was dated June 14, 1798. Her father had been 22 years old, a junior curate in a village in the Cotswolds, and he had been writing to the woman he loved, telling her about his parish duties and his loneliness and his growing conviction that she was the only woman in the world he would ever want. My dearest Charlotte, the letter began. I have counted the days since I last saw you, and the number is 47. I am not a superstitious man, but I have begun to wonder if the stars have aligned against us, if the universe itself is conspiring to keep us apart. And then I think, no, it cannot be. The same universe that has brought you into my life cannot mean to keep you from it. We will find a way, my love. We always have. Eleanor's throat tightened. She had heard her father speak of her mother in the same way, with the same wonder and gratitude and desperate hope. Their love had been the foundation of her childhood, the fixed point around which the rest of her small world revolved. And then her mother had died and her father had died, and Eleanor had been left with nothing but these letters and the memory of what it was like to be loved unconditionally. She turned the page. The next letter was dated 3 years later, after her parents had been married for a year, and it was written in a different hand, her mother's, and it was addressed not to her father but to her grandmother. Dear mother, I am happy to tell you that I am with child. I have not yet told my husband. I want it to be a surprise, and I want to be certain before I raise his hopes. I'm only a month along, but I have that feeling inside me, that deep certainty that life is taking root. I cannot help but hope it is a girl. I want a daughter, a little girl I can teach the things my own mother taught me. I want to give her a name that means something, a name that will carry her through the world. I have thought of Eleanor. It is a strong name, a good name. I hope she will be as brave as the name sounds. I hope she will be luckier than I have been." Eleanor touched the paper, traced the faded ink of her mother's handwriting. She had been born 9 months later, on a cold February morning, and her mother had died 3 years after that, leaving her father to raise her alone. He had done it. He had raised her with love and patience and the occasional fierce burst of temper that had taught her more than any amount of patient instruction. He had given her his love of poetry, his passion for justice, his stubborn belief that the world could be made better by good people doing good things. And then the world had taken him too. Eleanor folded the letter and put it back in the bundle. She tied the ribbon around the bundle and tucked it into the valise, and she lay back in the bed and stared at the ceiling again. She was a stranger now, in a strange room, married to a strange man, and she had no one to turn to but herself. They left the White Hart at dawn, in a hired chaise that Hawke had arranged the night before. The mist had lifted, and the day was bright and cold, with a wind that smelled of salt and the promise of winter. Eleanor sat in the chaise with her hands folded in her lap and watched the landscape change as they traveled north. The gentle green hills of the south gave way to the wilder, grimmer landscape of the north country, bleak moors and gray stone walls, villages that clung to the sides of valleys and long empty roads that stretched out toward a horizon that seemed to go on forever. Hawke had not spoken to her since they left the inn. He sat on the opposite seat, his face turned to the window, and he did not look at her. She could not tell what he was thinking. The scar on his face was stark in the cold morning light, and the gray eyes, when he finally turned them to her, were the eyes of a man who had seen too much and would not be troubled by anything again. "I should tell you about the estate," he said finally. "Should you?" "Yes." He paused as if choosing his words. "It is not an estate, really. It is a house. A large house, but it has been empty for 20 years. I inherited it from my uncle who died during the war. I have never lived there. I have never even seen it." "Your uncle left you a house you have never seen?" "I left England in '06 when I was 19. I did not return until last year. The house was waiting for me and He stopped. "I did not know what to do with it. I still do not know." "Then why are we going there?" "Because it is the only place I have." He turned to look at her, and something in his face shifted, became more open, more vulnerable. "I have nothing else, Eleanor. No family, no fortune, no prospects. I am a ruined man who has come home to a ruin, and I have brought you into it, and I am sorry." She looked at him for a long moment. The apology was unexpected, and she did not know what to do with it. He was offering her something, though she did not know what it was. "Don't be sorry," she said. "I knew what I was getting into. I knew you had nothing. I knew you were a stranger. I still said yes." "Why?" "Because I had nothing too. Because you were my only hope. Because I would rather be a stranger's wife than an old maid with no prospects and no future. I chose you, Captain Hawke. I chose you, and I will not complain about the consequences." He was silent for a long time. The chaise rattled on, the horses' hooves thudding on the rough road, the wind moaning around the window frames. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice was strange. "I'm not a good man. I'm not the man you remember from Plymouth. I have done things, seen things that have—" He stopped. "I have not always been able to live with what I have done. But I will try for you. I will try to be worthy of you." She did not know what to say to that. She only nodded, and she looked out the window at the bleak landscape passing, and she thought about the boy she remembered from the dockyards, the boy with the auburn hair and the freckles, the boy who had been kind to a little girl who had never seen the sea. That boy was gone. That boy had died in the war or in the years after, and the man who sat opposite her was a stranger. But she had married a stranger. She had made her choice and she would live with it. They reached the house in the late afternoon, as the sun was beginning to set behind a bank of heavy clouds. The road had led them along the coast for the last mile, with the sea on one side and the cliffs on the other, and Eleanor had found herself mesmerized by the wild beauty of it. The water was gray-green, churning and white-capped, and the seabirds wheeled overhead, crying to each other in their high, clear voices. And then the chaise rounded a headland, and the house appeared. It was not what she had expected. It was not a ruin exactly, though it had certainly seen better days. It was a large, square building of gray stone, 3 stories high, with a slate roof that sagged in the middle and a row of tall windows that stared out over the sea like empty eyes. The front door was flanked by 2 columns, the stucco peeling, and the gravel drive was overgrown with weeds. A single tree, bent by the wind, stood at the corner of the house, and its branches scraped against the stone walls with a sound like fingers on a slate. "It's not much," Hawk said, and his voice was carefully neutral. "It's not what I promised you. I'm sorry." She did not answer. She was looking at the house, at the rows of windows, at the roof that sagged and the door that was painted a faded green, and she was thinking, "This is my home now. This is where I will live. This is where I will die." The thought should have frightened her. Instead, it felt like a kind of relief. She had been homeless for so long that the prospect of having a place, even a ruin, was a comfort. "It's a house," she said. "It has rooms and windows and a door. That's more than I have had in 5 years." She climbed down from the chaise without waiting for his help, and she walked up the gravel drive to the front door, and she put her hand on the green door and pushed it open. The inside was worse than the outside. The hall was large and cold, with a floor of black and white tiles that were cracked and stained. A staircase rose at the far end, its banister broken, and the walls were covered with wallpaper that had once been blue and gold but had faded to a dull, dirty gray. The air was thick with dust and the smell of damp, and Eleanor could hear the sea from somewhere, a distant roar that seemed to come from the very walls. "This is going to take work," she said. "More work than you can imagine," Hawk agreed, and he sounded almost apologetic. "I should have told you, Eleanor. I should have told you what you were agreeing to." "I knew," she said, and she surprised herself with the truth of it. "I knew it would be something like this. I knew you would not be bringing me to a palace. I did not marry you for your house. What did you marry me for?" She turned to look at him, and the question hung between them like a sword over a thread. She could not answer it. She did not know what answer she would give. "I don't know," she said. "I am still trying to figure that out." He nodded, and he walked past her into the house, and she watched him go and felt a strange, unexpected flutter of something in her chest. It was not quite hope. She had given up hope years ago, but it was something like it, something that felt almost the same. The house on the cliff was filled with ghosts, and Eleanor learned their names in the long days that followed. The first ghost was Mrs. Pemberton, who had been the housekeeper when the house was still inhabited. She had stayed on after the uncle's death, waiting for the heir who never came, and she had grown old in the empty house, tending to it as if it were a living thing. She was a small, bird-like woman with white hair and a sharp tongue, and she had received Eleanor and Hawk with the suspicious gaze of a creature who had been guarding its territory for too long to trust strangers. "So you're the new master," she said to Hawk, looking him up and down with unconcealed skepticism. "I suppose you'll be wanting to change everything." "I suppose I will," Hawk said. "But not tonight. Tonight I would like a fire and something to eat." "A fire," Mrs. Pemberton said, and she made a small, dismissive sound. "You can't have a fire in the hall. The chimney has been blocked for 10 years. The drawing-room chimney works, but it's full of birds' nests. And the kitchen, well, you'll see the kitchen." Hawk looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at Mrs. Pemberton. Mrs. Pemberton looked at both of them with an expression that said she had seen it all and none of it impressed her. "I'll have the fire in the drawing-room," Eleanor said, and her voice was calm and measured, as if she were giving instructions to a servant. "And I'll need water and clean linens and a room where my husband and I can sleep. Can you manage that?" Mrs. Pemberton blinked. "I can manage it," she said, and her voice was grudging. "I suppose you'll want the master bedroom then? If it's the only bedroom that doesn't have a hole in the roof." Mrs. Pemberton's face tightened, and Eleanor thought she was going to refuse, but then the old woman's shoulders dropped and she nodded. "I'll see to it. But you'll have to give me time. I'm not as young as I used to be." "I'll help," Eleanor said. "I have done enough work in my life to know how to manage a house. Show me where everything is and we'll get it done together." Mrs. Pemberton looked at her for a long moment. "You're not what I expected," she said. "I thought you would be a spoiled little thing, all lace and nonsense. But you look like you've worked before." "I have," Eleanor said. "I've been a companion for the past 5 years. That's a kind of work even if it doesn't pay much." "Humph," Mrs. Pemberton said, and she turned and walked away, leaving Eleanor alone in the hall with Hawk. He was looking at her with a curious expression on his face. "You handled that very well," he said. "I have had years of practice at handling difficult people," she said. "Your housekeeper is no harder than my aunt, and she is considerably more honest." "Is she?" "I don't know," Eleanor admitted. "But I think so. I hope so." He nodded. "I hope so too. We need all the honesty we can get." That night, Eleanor lay in the large bed in the master bedroom and listened to the sounds of the house settling around her. The wind was howling outside, rattling the windows and screaming around the corners of the house, and the sea was a constant roar, a sound so present that she thought she might never be able to sleep without it. Hawk was sleeping on the floor again, his figure wrapped in a blanket, his face turned away from her. She watched the rise and fall of his breathing for a long time, and then she closed her eyes and tried to sleep. She dreamed of her father. She was a child again, sitting on his lap in the small study at the vicarage, and he was reading to her from a book of poetry. The fire was crackling and the rain was falling outside and everything was warm and safe and right. "Eleanor," her father said, and his voice was gentle. "You must always remember, you are not alone. There are people in the world who love you even when you can't feel them. I love you. Your mother loves you. We will never leave you." "Promise?" she asked, and her voice was small. "I promise," he said, and his arms tightened around her. "I promise." She woke with the tears on her face. The room was dark, the fire had gone out, and the wind was still howling. She could hear Hawk's breathing, steady and even, and she wondered if he had heard her crying. She wiped her face and lay back on the pillow. The dream had been so real, so warm, and the world was so cold. She had been alone for so long. She had forgotten what it was like to be held. It was Mrs. Pemberton who showed Eleanor the portrait. They had been in the house for 3 days, and Eleanor had already begun to make her mark on it. She had scrubbed the floors in the kitchen, aired out the linens, and started a fire in the drawing room that had not smoked. The house was beginning to feel almost habitable, and Hawk had been spending most of his days outside, walking the coast, coming back with salt on his clothes and a look in his eyes that she could not read. On the 4th day Mrs. Pemberton found Eleanor in the drawing room, polishing the mirror above the fireplace. "There's something you should see," the old woman said, and her voice was strange. "Something in the attic. I think it belongs to you." "To me?" Eleanor said, surprised. "I don't think there's anything in this house that belongs to me." "You never know," Mrs. Pemberton said, and she turned and walked away. Eleanor followed her up the narrow stairs to the attic, and she found herself in a low-ceilinged room filled with the debris of centuries. There were trunks and boxes, furniture covered in dust sheets, and a dark shape in the corner that Eleanor did not recognize. Mrs. Pemberton walked to the dark shape and pulled off the dust sheet, and Eleanor saw that it was a portrait, a life-size portrait of a woman painted in oils, framed in gold. The woman was young, perhaps 20, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to look right through Eleanor. She was wearing a green gown, and there was a small, enigmatic smile on her lips, and there was something about the set of her jaw and the tilt of her chin that was achingly familiar. "She looks like you," Mrs. Pemberton said. "I saw it the moment you walked through the door. She looks exactly like you." Eleanor stepped forward, her heart pounding. She had never seen the portrait before. She had never seen the woman before. But she knew her, somehow, in the same way that she knew her own face in the mirror. "Who is she?" Eleanor asked, and her voice was barely a whisper. "I don't know," Mrs. Pemberton said. "The portrait was in the master bedroom when I first came to this house, and then Mr. Hawk's uncle moved it up here. He said it was too beautiful to look at, and he could not bear to see it any more." Eleanor looked at the painting, and she had a strange, dizzying sensation, as if the world had tipped slightly on its axis. She looked at the woman, and the woman looked back, and Eleanor thought, "This is my mother. This is my mother's face." But it could not be. Her mother had died when Eleanor was 3. She had been buried in the village churchyard in a grave beneath a yew tree. The woman in the portrait was not her mother. Was she? "Mrs. Pemberton," Eleanor said, "when did you first come to this house?" 35 years ago. I was a young woman then, not much older than you. I was hired by the old master, Mr. Hawk's father he was. He told me the house had been in the family for centuries, and he needed someone to keep it in order. And the portrait was already here? It was already here. Mrs. Pemberton paused. "I asked about it once when I was young. The old master told me it was a secret, and if I knew what was good for me I would never speak of it again." Eleanor looked at the portrait and she felt the world tipping again. She had come to this house as a stranger, married to a stranger, and now she had found a face that was the mirror of her own. "Leave me with it," she said. "Please, Mrs. Pemberton. Leave me with the portrait." Mrs. Pemberton left, and Eleanor was alone in the attic, with the portrait and the dust and the silence of a house that had been hiding its secrets for 35 years. "Who are you?" she asked the painted woman. "Who are you and why do you look like me?" The woman did not answer. She only smiled, and Eleanor thought she could see, in the curve of her lips, the ghost of a secret that she was not ready to tell. Eleanor did not tell Hawk about the portrait. She did not know why. The discovery had unsettled her, and she needed time to think, to understand, to decide what to do with the knowledge. She had come to this house as a stranger, and she had found a face that was her own, and she did not know what it meant. She went down to the library that evening, intending to ask Mrs. Pemberton if she remembered anything more about the portrait. But when she entered the room she found Hawk there, his back to her, and he was staring at the wall at something that she had not noticed before. A miniature portrait hanging in a small gold frame. It was of a woman, the same woman Eleanor realized, the one from the attic. "The portrait," she said, and her voice was strange. "You know about it?" He turned to look at her and his face was pale. "Yes," he said. "I know about it. I have known about it since I was a boy." He moved aside and Eleanor walked forward to look at the miniature. It was smaller than the portrait, but it was the same woman, the same dark hair, the same enigmatic smile. "Your uncle," Eleanor said. "He knew her." "My father knew her," Hawk said, and his voice was barely a whisper. "My father married her. He married her and she died and he never spoke of her again." Eleanor felt the floor tilt under her feet. "Your father married her? That's impossible. He was married to your mother." "He was married to. My mother died when I was born," Hawk said. "My father remarried a few years later. He married a woman named Charlotte. She died when I was 3. I barely remember her." Eleanor looked at the portrait and the world went very still. Charlotte. Her mother's name. "My mother's name was Charlotte," she said. "My mother died when I was 3, just like your father's second wife. And she looked like this. She looked exactly like this." Hawk stared at her. "What are you saying?" "I don't know." Eleanor's voice was shaking. "I don't know what I'm saying. But the woman in this portrait, she looks like me. She looks like my mother. She has my mother's face." Hawk stepped back. His face had gone white and his hands were shaking. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice was strange. "Eleanor, your father's name was Ashworth, wasn't it?" "Yes." "And your mother's maiden name?" Eleanor thought about it. She had never really thought about it before. Her mother had been Charlotte and she had married her father and she had died, and that was all she had ever known. "I don't know," she said. "I don't know her maiden name. I never thought to ask." "Charlotte," Hawk said, and his voice was hollow. "The woman in the portrait was named Charlotte. My father's second wife was named Charlotte. And she looked exactly like you." Eleanor looked at the portrait, and she felt the truth of what he was saying settle over her like a shroud. "You're not my husband," she said, and her voice was faint. "You're my brother." The night was long. Eleanor sat in the library with Hawk, and they talked until the candles burned down and the fire went out, and they talked until the first gray light of dawn was creeping through the windows. They were not siblings. That was the first discovery, and it was almost a relief. Charlotte had been married to Hawk's father, but she had been married to Eleanor's father too. She had been married to one and then the other, and the two marriages had overlapped in ways that were too tangled to unravel. "I don't understand," Eleanor said, and her voice was tired. "How could she have been married to both of them? How could she have been married to your father and my father?" Hawk's face was grim. "I don't know," he said. "But I think I know who does. Mrs. Pemberton has been in this house for 35 years. She knows more than she's told us." They found Mrs. Pemberton in the kitchen making tea. She looked up as they entered and her face fell. "You found the portrait," she said. "I told you not to speak of it." "Tell us the truth," Eleanor said, and her voice was hard. "Tell us everything." Mrs. Pemberton sighed. She was silent for a long time, and then she set down the teapot and sat at the table, her hands folded before her. "Your mother was a beautiful woman," she said. "She was the most beautiful woman I ever saw. And she was the most unhappy woman I ever saw. She married Mr. Hawk because her family had fallen into poverty, and she thought he would save them. But he was not a kind man. He was not a gentle man. And she began to look for comfort elsewhere." Eleanor's heart was pounding. "Elsewhere?" "She found it," Mrs. Pemberton said. "She found it in a kind, gentle man who was visiting the estate on business. He was a clergyman, a man of letters, and he made her feel," she paused. "He made her feel like she was worth something. He made her feel like she was not just a possession." "My father," Eleanor said, and her voice was barely a whisper. Mrs. Pemberton nodded. "Your father. Mr. Edmund Ashworth. He came to the estate to do some work for Mr. Hawk's father, and he met Charlotte and they fell in love. It was a terrible scandal. It was the kind of scandal that destroys lives. And they tried to run away together, but they were caught and Charlotte was forced to choose." "Choose what?" "Choose who she would stay with," Mrs. Pemberton said. "She chose Mr. Hawk because she was his wife and she had no other choice. But she never loved him. She never stopped loving your father. And when she knew she was carrying his child." "My father's child?" Eleanor said, and her voice was strange. Your father's child, Mrs. Pemberton confirmed. She knew you were your father's child, and she was afraid of what Mr. Hawke would do if he found out. So she did the only thing she could do, she sent you away. She sent you to your father's family to be raised as his child, and she stayed behind to face the consequences. Eleanor sat down heavily in the nearest chair. Her legs would not hold her. Her mother had not been a stranger, a woman who had died of consumption. She had been a woman who had loved her, a woman who had given her up to save her life. That's why the portrait looks like me, she said. That's why she looked like me. She was my mother. Yes, Mrs. Pemberton said. She was your mother. And she loved you. She loved you more than anything in the world. Eleanor felt the tears on her face. She had been alone for so long, and she had not known that she had been loved, and the knowledge of it was almost too much to bear. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Why now? Because it's time, Mrs. Pemberton said. Because you deserve to know. Because your mother would have wanted you to know the truth. Hawke found Eleanor on the cliff the next morning, looking out over the sea. The wind was blowing her hair around her face, and she was clutching her shawl around her shoulders, and she looked so small and so alone that his heart ached for her. Eleanor, he said, and his voice was gentle. Are you all right? She turned to look at him, and he could see that she had been crying. I don't know, she said. I don't know what to do with it. All of it. The truth. My mother. You. I don't know what to do with it either, he admitted. But I know one thing, I am not your brother. I'm not your sibling. We are not blood. No, she said. We are not. But we are still strangers. We don't have to be, he said. We can learn. We can try. She looked at him for a long moment and then she said, What did you do in the war? What did you do that you can't tell me? He was silent for a long moment. I was a captain, he said. I was given orders to do things that I did not want to do. I carried them out because I was a soldier and that was what soldiers do. And then one day I was given an order that I could not carry out, and I refused, and I was stripped of my command and sent home in disgrace. What was the order? He was silent again. Then he said, I was told to burn a village. It was a village in Spain and it was full of women and children. The French had passed through it and there were some French soldiers still there, and my commander told me to burn it to the ground. I refused. I told him it was not worth it, that the women and children were innocent. And he told me that in war no one is innocent. Eleanor was silent for a long moment. And then what happened? Nothing, Hawke said. I was court-martialed and stripped of my command, but I was not imprisoned because the war had ended and no one wanted the scandal. I was sent back to England in disgrace, and I have been in disgrace ever since. And the scar on your face? I got it in the war in a battle. It was not honorable. I did not get it fighting for my country. I got it running away. Eleanor looked at him and he could see the sympathy in her eyes. He did not want her sympathy. He did not deserve it. Thank you for telling me, she said. Thank you for trusting me. You are my wife, he said. You are the only person in the world who knows the truth about me. I have to trust you. I don't have anyone else. She nodded and she looked back out over the sea. I think, she said, that we should start over. We should stop being strangers. We should try to be friends. I would like that, he said. I would like that very much. They stood together on the cliff, looking out over the sea, and the wind blew around them, and for the first time they did not feel like strangers. Weeks passed and the house on the cliff began to feel like a home. Eleanor worked alongside Mrs. Pemberton to bring the place back to life, and Hawke took on the task of repairing the roof and the chimneys and the broken windows. They spoke every day in the evenings in the library, with the fire burning and the sea roaring in the distance. They talked about their childhoods, their hopes, their fears, their secrets. They talked about everything and slowly they began to understand each other. One evening, Hawke came to her with a letter in his hand. It was from a lawyer in London, and it contained news that had been a long time coming. The estate, he said. The legal settlement. It's finally been settled. I am the rightful owner of the house and of the land surrounding it, and of the income that comes with it. I'm glad, Eleanor said, and she meant it. I've already signed it over to you, he said. Everything. The house, the land, the income. It's yours now. Eleanor stared at him. Why would you do that? Because it was never mine to keep, he said. It belonged to my father, and my father bought it with the money he used to ruin your family. It belongs to you. It's yours. I was only keeping it for you. Eleanor was silent for a long moment. She felt the tears on her face and she did not try to wipe them away. Thank you, she said. Thank you for everything. I married you for convenience, he said. But I love you, Eleanor. I have loved you from the moment I saw you in the church, with the lavender on your dress and the ring that didn't fit. I love you and I will always love you. She crossed the room to him and she took his hand and she looked into his eyes. I love you too, she said. I love you and I'm not going to let you go. They stood in the library with the fire burning and the sea roaring in the distance, and they held each other, and they knew that they would never be strangers again. The next morning, Eleanor went up to the attic and took the portrait down. She carried it to the drawing room and hung it above the fireplace, where it would catch the morning light, and she stood back to look at it. Her mother's face looked down at her and she felt the weight of the years lifting. She was no longer alone. She had a family. She had a home. And she knew finally that she had made the right choice. Thank you, she said to the portrait. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for letting me go. Thank you for bringing me here. The woman in the portrait smiled, and Eleanor thought she could see, in the corner of her eyes, the ghost of tears. The seasons changed. The days grew longer, the sun grew warmer, and the house on the cliff came alive with flowers and birds and the sound of children's laughter. Eleanor and Hawk had 2 children, a boy with dark hair and gray eyes and a girl with auburn hair and freckles. They grew up in the house on the cliff and they learned to love the sea and they knew that they were loved. Eleanor never forgot what she had been through. She never forgot the years of poverty and loneliness, the years of being a stranger in a strange land. But she also never forgot that she had found her way home. I was a stranger once, she told her children on the long summer evenings, with the fire burning and the sea roaring in the distance. I was a stranger and I had no one. And then I found your father and I found this house and I found my mother's face in a portrait in the attic. And I learned that love is the only thing that matters. Love is what brings us home. She looked out the window at the sea and she thought about her mother and she thought about her father, and she thought about the boy with the auburn hair and the freckles who had been kind to a little girl on the dockyards. She was no longer a stranger. She was no longer alone. She was home.